Okay. So all that being said, we can move on to our next slide. Where we talk about Black women's historical relationship with sex. So if Amara, you can start speaking and then I'll just like add in where I see fit.
Okay, sure. So like Black women's like historical like relationships with sex is always been because like Black women's bodies are always like scripted historically like negatively. So her body is deemed as sexually overdeveloped, excessive and immoral. Like the Black woman's body is presented in animalistic ways, commodified to greater extent than like white women. So like because of the over-sexualization of Black women, it results in many times that her experiences are of rape and sexual violence are not deemed as rape. She is held more responsible for what has happened to her than other women are done so, and she's always questioned, what were you doing in such sort of environment. So like historically, Black women's bodies are often like subjected to like voyeuristic sort of consumption. And so you have like a picture there of Sarita Bartman, who was a South African sort of slave, unwilling, and he was just like sent and transported to London like in the early 1800s. And she was basically put on an exhibit as part of some form of like freak show. She was displayed and put in cages, which are normally bears are put in. She was dehumanized. She was transported around circuses, museums and bars where people paid 2 cents or under to look at her, prod her, gawk at her, and like basically poke her because of her large features. And because of her being a Black woman, this sort of dehumanization was not seen as anything other than gawking at something that isn't a human, and she's completely dehumanized. There's another pamphlet there from I'm going to forget the museum, but this really cool museum, which basically just demonstrate the sort of portrayal of Black women in 3 different ways. And so it is the Mammy, the Jezebel, and the Sapphire. The Mammy is more of the Aunt Jemima sort of caricature, and the whole like her only purpose is to sort of breastfeed and feed and like nurture, but that is it. She's the disposable sort of entity. And of course the Sapphire is that of the aggressive, the aggressive Black woman, the violent, the animalistic Black woman, but then, and the Jezebel is where you see the full-fledged sort of sexual over-sexualization of Black women appears, where she's overly sexual, she's only in relationships for sex, she has no purpose but that. And I think because of sort of this sort of presentation of Black women, it's resulted in our culture, within cultures where Black mothers, as a form of like self-preservation to protect themselves and their children and their daughters, have now adopted a form of like hush-hush sort of relationship with sex. It is more of, in order to protect my daughters, they must not talk about sex, they must not interact with such associations and such stereotypes. They must be quiet and see chastity as their only form of protection. And then this has resulted in Black women being sort of shamed to talk about sex, to like sex, to discuss it. And instead, like we're taught that chastity is what maintains our value in a world that devalues us. Chastity allows us to play into the good girl trope and allows us to be deserving of respect and be rewarded at the very end with a good husband or a good life partner. So like virginity is a prize in which we are gifted, we give to our partners in exchange for their love and their respect and their devotion and all of these sort of things. And so you just see a timeline of women being over-sexualized. And so as a result of self-preservation, we kind of protect ourselves and we kind of say, no, we have to now completely avoid sex at all cost. Of course, religion plays a lot into this as well, where religious beliefs are sort of shaming women and teaching women that sex isn't for pleasure, it is for reproduction only. And so in order to reproduce, it must be in the confines of marriage alone. And these are a lot of women entering sort of like marriages where they don't understand what sex is. They don't feel like they can explore themselves. And many of times, a lot of women don't realize it, but they do need therapy in order to enjoy sex in their sort of marital lives, because they've been taught for many years that they shouldn't enjoy it. But then once they're married, they're supposed to flip this switch to now suddenly be this sort of portrayal of this amazing sexual being, which is not possible when you've been cast away from the topic for so long. Rachel, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, that was amazing, Amara. I think you covered a lot, and I think it was, I think the relationship, it's found in the Mami, it's found in the Jezebel, it's found in the Sapphire. I think I'm just going to talk about the picture with like the breastfeeding, like Black women. I think what we find during colonialism, during slavery, is that many Black women, in order to provide like milk for their master's children, they themselves would actually have to get pregnant, because your body doesn't just create milk, it creates milk because it knows that there's a baby. So yeah, I think just during slavery and during that whole period, we see that many Black women were forced to have sex and forced to have babies, and those children that they did give birth to, if they survived, they weren't able to be in the same, like they weren't able to be proximate to them, as they had other responsibilities because their labor was in such high demand, and because their labor was being exploited. So that's just on that. And also the picture at the bottom left of Harriet Jacobs, she was an ex-slave, and she's most infamously known for incidents in the life of a slave girl, and people know that book because of her experience of sexual assault by her slave master. And I think it says a lot in how Black women's stories become archived and how people remember Black women, because Harriet Jacobs lived a long life. Well, yeah, she lived a long life from 1813 to 1897. And the seminal thing that we know about her is her incident of sexual assault, and how that enabled her, and how that was used, how that was used in order to grant her freedom, not because she was like deserving of freedom, not because slavery was wrong, but because she, a young child, was sexually assaulted. And it says a lot on how sex and sexual violence is understood by the judges of society, whoever we understand them to be, and how we need to be in a state of vulnerability in order for us to be sexually autonomous. And yeah, I think that relationship is quite sinister, but we'll talk about it more in the next slide. So yeah, let's talk about sex and Black womanhood. So this is an excerpt from a Galdem article, and I included it because I think a lot of the time when we do talk about sex, we talk about it in a very heteronormative, in a very ableist way, and we don't really consider the different ways in which different women and different people just have sex. And the sexual education, which we will also get into, isn't catered towards that. So I'll read this excerpt out, and then Amara, you can add anything, and then we'll just like pose questions to you, everyone. So it reads: if ingrained ideas of sex are tied to an ability to do certain things, then navigating the world of sex as a disabled woman is more complex than you can imagine. It can be awkward and difficult engaging in sexual encounters if what your body can do has changed or it is different from the widely accepted norm. Societal ideas of sex and romance play an important role in the way in which we approach our vision of self within interactions. So yeah, I just thought I'd include that in a moment you can go.
Yeah, so like at the very top, there's this sort of stat from a 2017 study, which is basically like Black girls are as young as 5 are seen as more mature, innocent, sexually aware, leading to these girls being ignored when reporting and discussing sort of sexual assault. And it's, I think it's what we've touched upon beforehand, but it's this whole idea that even the Black girl isn't afforded the same privileges as the white girl. She's not bubble wrapped or protected or sort of nurtured in a way. She is seen as already being sexually deviant and sexually othered, and she's over sexualized, and so she isn't believed. Her experiences of sexual assault aren't believed, and this just results in problems within our own community, because if a lot of us have stories or know of people with stories of the uncle or the predatory uncle who has been allowed into our lives, into our vicinities, who is like enacting harm and essentially either raping or, sorry, trigger warnings, like raping or like sexually assaulting us. But the mothers or the fathers and the people within our families don't do anything about it, don't care about those experiences, dismiss it or see it as normal, because this Black girl body is already sexualized. So, and so sometimes we have like guests in the house and we're being told to cover up, or we're being told to not dress in that way, or to cover ourselves, instead of parents interrogating what type of person are you going to invite to this house that will be a risk to your own child, that they have to be the ones to cover up. Why are they being welcomed in such a safe space, which is supposed to be our homes? But yeah, back to Rachel with the questions.
Yeah, I was honestly just going to draw on that. I think, what did I have written down? Many, yeah, as you were saying, many Black girls, they are sexualized at a very young age. And I think also because of the lack of education, many Black girls, they know that it's wrong and they know that it doesn't feel right, but there's no labeling, like there's no names put towards it. So it then obviously makes that young girl very vulnerable and very like isolated in that situation, because everything is going on and it feels wrong, but there's just no name for it. So that leads on to the first question. How do you think the hypersexualization of Black girls and women, that's meant to be women, alters their relationship with sex? And in what ways does the fetishization of Blackness impact Black women's relationship with sex and all things involved in sex? And that fetishization could be directed to like Black men or Black women or Black non-binaries. So this is just open up to everyone. You can put your hand up in the reactions and then it should say raise hands. Or Amara, if you want to answer the questions, and then we can bounce off each other, and if anyone just feels comfortable to add in. Yeah, you can also put it in the chat as well. I'll read it out.
Okay, is there anything in the chat so far? Okay, I think we touched upon this earlier, but I think the hypersexualization of Black girls and women means that we have very negative relationships with sex. Like there is a lot of shame associated with even talking about this. I know for me personally, I never spoke about, I'm very lucky that I grew up with a mother who always talks about sex with me, but I felt ashamed that she was talking about sex to me constantly. Like every year she would like revisit the topic of sex with me to like update me. And I'm like, please leave me alone. I'm like shy. I'm like a little girl. And I kept playing that. And I felt ashamed of her telling me these things. And so I had to sort of like interrogate, because I was like, okay, so the shame surrounding sex didn't come from within my household. So where did I get this sort of shame? And it's outside. I've been socialized within society to just believe that I shouldn't understand and I shouldn't interact with sex until marriage. I should jump from chastity, like virginity, like saving myself. And then only then, when I enter like a marriage, I should now jump and be like this completely different human being. And so it's a very unhealthy relationship with sex. It means we can get exploited, we can get hurt and harm very easily, and because we don't know any better, we don't know, and we don't have the words to identify that this is wrong and this is right, because we haven't been taught anything. And it's just a shame, because sex can be a freeing thing, sex can be a great thing, but also sex is a key part of an integral part of our society. And it's not fair that like some groups of girls aren't given this knowledge of something that is so integral within society, or occurs so often within society, that we're losing a part of knowledge. But what does other people think? Nicole, your hand is up.
You can speak. I don't think we can hear you, or I can't hear
you. Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. I was gonna agree with Amara, and I feel like the hypersexualization of Black women and stuff kind of makes it a bit more shunned, and you don't really talk about things like that. Like I feel like being like, say for example, having like, say like having sex or dating and having sex with multiple partners or having sex at a young age and stuff like that, all of that is very much shunned, whereas I feel like it's more openly discussed in, for example, like white communities and stuff like that. And even in terms of the acts of sex, so for example, I feel like for or like for a black woman to give a blowjob is seen as a bit more like that, it's more downturned than if a white woman were to give a blowjob, and that would be more like openly spoken about and stuff like that. Or like various sex acts you just can't do because of the way that it's been portrayed, I guess, differently in the black community and stuff like that. And like discussing that and discussing sexuality and stuff like that and all of that. And like with boys as well, in terms of like masculinity and expressing yourself sexually, I feel like a lot of that is just shunned away from.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think when it's like black boys doing the sexualizing, it's quite difficult to have that conversation. So, for example, I went to an all girls school, and it's like if a boy was to, all girls secondary school, if a boy was to like sexualize you, then it would be good because, you know, you're getting attention. All like the boys, like, you know, like, oh, it's a bit, it's like it's made into something that we like in ourselves. We know that it doesn't feel good, but because everyone else in like this heteronormative society is telling us that male attention is good, it doesn't matter how you get it or why you get it, really, as long as you get it in the end. So yeah, I completely agree. And I think on the second question on fetishization, when it comes to, I think oftentimes we know that non-black women, non-black women, especially white women, fetishize black men, and how black men play into that and kind of reaffirm racist ideals is also violent towards black women. So say for example, a black man might say, oh yeah, like I only go for white women because black women are aggressive in bed. It's still using that language of aggression that we understand exists outside of, or that we think exists outside of sex, that we know impacts us in that wider society, and how that is also playing in. And the black man, maybe he knows that he's being sexualized, maybe he knows that he's being fetishized, maybe he doesn't, but through that process it creates even more harm towards the black woman, or yeah, towards the black woman in that situation. So Nicole, you can go.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like, so say for example, I was like speaking to my housemates yesterday, because my voice, I'm so sorry. I was speaking to my housemates yesterday about how like essentially like the Kardashians, and how it's a lot easier for them to accept and forgive Tristan, who cheated on Khloe, if you didn't know, as opposed to the black woman. He didn't cheat on her, but like it's complicated. But like in terms of, they didn't forgive they didn't forgive Jordan, who is a black woman who didn't do anything wrong, but they forgave the black man who did something wrong. And like I feel like that sort of dynamic of like being more accepting of black men and not necessarily supporting or uplifting black women. And I feel like also the fetishization of like just other races in general, like being told, oh, I've never been with a black woman before, or being told, I wonder what the sex is like with black, like stuff like that. And also like in terms of like the like stereotyping in like other races as well. So like the notion that for someone who's like Southeast Asian to be timid and shy and docile and stuff like that is a very appealing, and like it implicates the, like in terms of like sex trafficking or sex tourism and stuff like that, where men travel from the Western world into places like Thailand and like Singapore because they fetishize the timidness and the submissiveness of the women that are there. So yeah, that was just my 2 cents on feminization.
Yeah, and just kind of going off that before we go on to the next slide, what you spoke about sex trafficking, like in West Africa now, sex trafficking is like very high. I don't know if it's at the highest rate that it's ever been, but it is very high. And you think about how sex trafficking and how Black women are, in fact, we will get onto sex work later, how Black women are put in a financial position where sex work is the only work that they can do to survive, but their survival is then, it's not secure because of the violence of sex work inherently. So it just creates like a cyclical relationship where Black women, because of like capitalism and because of all these systems of oppression, Black women are now in a place of submission and of vulnerability, and they now need to use sex and use their womanhood in order to survive. Whether that survival exists alongside fetishization, or whether it exists alongside hypersexualization, it's like it doesn't matter. All these, not that it doesn't matter, but it's not significant enough for them to like not engage with sex work. But we will get onto that later. So if we can go to the next slide. So Amara, do you want to take?
Okay, so this is like one of my favorite sort of topics when talking about sex, is because especially within radical, I'm going to use the word radical, but I'm always going to put it in air quotations because that word has been bastardized and like it's completely emptied of its meaning, and I hate it, but just because we know what I mean by that, I'm going to use it, but just know that I'm wincing inside as I do say the word. But within like radical spaces, we don't interrogate sort of like how our interpersonal relationships and our sexual relationships align with our political beliefs and now the beliefs that we hold ourselves within our activism sort of lives. So it's like, it's important that our politics are represented and apparent, like every aspect of like our lives, and we maintain sort of like a genuinity in sort of our relationships. And I think I love this quote here, sort of like one of my favorite ones, this tweet, I mean, is because like there is this difficulty in hiding or maintaining a facade of what our political beliefs are within our personal, sexual and romantic lives, just like due to the nature of the intimacy and the closeness of these relationships. It's harder to sort of hide just because desire reveals a lot, essentially. So therefore we, like, as people with certain beliefs, we must ensure that we are like being proactive and like constantly interrogating like our thoughts, our beliefs, and even our actions and our practices to ensure that we're not creating sort of two separate standards and two separate sort of identities for ourselves, where our political public life is here, but our sexual private life is here, and we try and separate the political from the sexual because sex is always political. So like on a very simple level, and this is what we see as the sort of Twitter discussions and debate about preferences, most Black people, and this is something like Bell Hooks wrote, but like most Black people confront like white supremacy in the context of like Blackness, and either through our discussion of Blackness or our responses to our own appearance of Blackness or other people's appearances of Blackness. And so it's about interrogating the types of people we are consistently finding attractive while we do so, our dating pool, and the people that we are drawn to consistently, and the people that we say are deserving of our love affection. It doesn't mean we can't date a wide range of people, but if the only people that we're dating is this certain shade, we need to interrogate that, because it's very much tied into white supremacy and the idea that attraction is the closer someone is to whiteness, the more attractive and more appealing and more deserving of love, care they are, and the further away they are. So like darker skinned Black women especially, they should be brutalized, ignored, dismissed and cast aside because they're not deserving of love. They are othered. And if society is doing so and we hold politics, why are we replicating, we hold these sort of political beliefs, radical beliefs, why are we replicating such structures in our own dating lives? So like even as Black women or Black women in heterosexual relationships, you're all suffering, I just do have to say, with lighter skin complexion, but hold such like radical beliefs and political beliefs. It's about interrogating the type of men who are attracted to us and we allow within our vicinity, because if these men are attracted to us because of their lighter complexion, they hold colorist beliefs, they hold very violent, dangerous beliefs, and they may not be a problem to us, But when we are organizing and we're creating and cultivating a radical space, a safe space, and we are allowing these sexual partners, these romantic partners, into the safe space, they are going to be replicating their sexism, misogynoir, their colorism, their violence into our safe space cultivated for the most marginalized within society. And so we may not be facing any harm based on our association with them, but those around us will be. And our dating life, we must understand, isn't just some exclusive private thing. It interacts with everything that we're doing. And we're ensuring that we are creating a safe space, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us, because that's what our political lives are supposed to be. And that's on a very basic level. But also, like, because of the patriarchal society that we live in, there will always be power imbalances. And in an ideal world, if we can avoid it, we must avoid the power imbalances within our relationships. But sometimes in heterosexual relationship, it's very difficult to sort of avoid it. And so it is important to be vigilant in the way in which we are using power, and we're allowing power imbalances to sort of perform themselves within our relationships, and we ensure that we are avoiding abuses of these power. But also, like, moving on to like abolitionist sort of practices and beliefs and how they interact with our sexual relationships, we must shift the way we respond to or deal with like harm within our relationships. We must ensure that we are not sort of replicating like the caste structures, and we like relying on and like replaying like punitive sort of logics and practices in these relationships, which mean that if we are harmed or if someone within us is harmed, our first sort of reaction is punishment and isolation of this individual from the group and casting them out. Instead, we must be offering support to those who have been harmed, but also the person who has been harmed. And of course, this is easier said than done. But if these are our politics, that we're trying to move from the police state and the carceral sort of state that we live in, we must ensure that we're doing so in our like personal, like sort of sexual lives as well. That the way we deal with harm is in a way that is sort of collective and loving, and they are able to be held accountable for their harm, but in a way that is without shame, that allows them to learn to not replicate it at all. So it's sort of dealing with the issue and not allowing it to occur as well. So like even in like in our casual relationship, no, it's perfectly fine. Still perfectly fine. Yeah, thank you. See ya. Guys, I'm in the library, sorry. So even in like our casual relationships, we're ensuring that we are adopting the logic. And I basically, this like amazing quote, that no one is disposable. So even in very casual sexual relationships, we're not treating people as disposable beings, that even if they are casual, they are not supposed to be permanent. There is still sort of like a form of care and tenderness that should be within these relationships, that we're ensuring that pleasure is present for them and ourselves as well. And that these relationships, although temporary, are not always, they're not a means to an end. And we're not treating them as the same disposable function sort of based way that society does. We get? Sorry, that's just...
Amara, I could listen to you speak all day. Please, please. Just a few things I'll add on. What you're saying about personal politics, like just lining up with desire and desirability is so important, because then we'll see when Black women or just women in general get into like romantic or sexual relationships with someone who is violent and someone who is harmful, and then they're then allowed into those spaces, it then is violent towards the people within those spaces. And because desire is just so temporary, it like we know that, okay, whilst it is informed by like fat phobia, racism, colorism, all of these things, yeah, they have real effects. At the end of the day, they are structures, but then the very structures have...
Where'd you get the link from?
The link?
Oh, sorry.
I didn't hear you, but if you can just put it in the chat, then I'll hear what you said. But yeah, the violence and the harm that is now that people within those spaces are faced with, it's traumatic, and then recovering from that trauma will just take so much. And it's like if you really like self-analyze and did a bit of introspection, then all of that harm could have been avoided. And I think we do have a responsibility, and just not even a responsibility, but why would you want to be with someone who's homophobic? Like, babe, but you're at Pride. Like, it just doesn't add up. So yeah, there needs some consistency, and I think people's politics do need to line up, because at the end of the day, your politics doesn't only exist in terms of like voting for Labour or Tory like parties. Like, that is a very minor element of it. A large element of it is interpersonal relationships. You need to show people love the way that you are screaming for other people to show love. Like, it needs to be evident, basically. So I completely agree with what you said. If anyone else has anything that they want to add, or if the person who spoke can either put their hand up or put it in the chat, that would be great. Or if not, we could just move on to the next slide. Okay, so on social media, I think social media has been a major way for a lot of Black women to talk about sex openly. So I've included two main people who I've personally seen and heard talk about sex on social media openly to Black women. And the first is Oloni, who always starts a thread with ladies, and I love it because you know what time it is. And also Makai, and yeah, these two women, they talk about sex openly, and they talk about not only like sex in terms of like sexual intercourse, but also experiences, which are also very important. Because I mean, not to get too like historian-y and archivist-y, but the fact that Oloni does these threads and people, Black women, talk to her and tell her of their experiences, and that all these experiences are made visible to other people and other younger Black women who can also learn from those experiences, can see community within those spaces. So I think it's very important that we do talk about sex openly, and I think social media is a good way to talk about it, because it's like everyone's on social media. Well, basically everyone's on social media. And that's a way for us to collate our experiences. And even if you're not comfortable talking about your experiences, then also hearing from other people's experiences. Because I know that there was that thing last year on Twitter, like at the beginning of COVID, where people in Warwick were talking about their experiences of sexual assault and sexual violence. And this timeline was very interesting to see, to say the very least. But we really saw how people's politics line up with their romantic life. We see how, I don't know, it was just a lot, and it opened my eyes especially, and my eyes wouldn't have been opened if it wasn't for social media and people talking about it openly. So if anyone wants to add, or if Amara, you want to add again, feel free to put it in the chat. You know the drill.
Quickly want to add, I think it's also really important that like Black women are utilizing social media to sort of like reframe the way in which we see sex, especially as Black women, because the same social media is one where Black rappers and like artists and people in the media put Black women in music videos just for the body, to over sexualize us. So it's like is it re-technologizing? That's the word. Learned it from Goldie, absolute babe. But I think we're re-technologized. I don't want to butcher the word. I'm going to ask her again. But we're using social media, and we're taking it back and saying we're going to use this space in a very progressive but in a safer way for us. And I think it's really important that we have these very visible Black women who are talking about sex, because like we've already touched upon and we're going to touch upon further, the way in which we're taught sex in schools is appalling. And so a lot of Black women do not know many things, or don't know things are wrong, or don't know these sort of information. And so if we have people who are talking about it, who look like us, or from our like so lived experiences, we can understand. We have to learn. So this is a form of like community learning, and it's a form of community care which just exists in a very online space, which is amazing because it's reaching people from different countries and communities as well. So I do love it. But yeah.
Yeah, I do love it as well. So, well, once Nurse sits back down, she's just getting food. So let's talk about sex work. I think sex work, when we talk about sex, it's quite, I think a lot of people maybe shy away from sex work because of how, because of its nature. Yeah, because of its nature. So these are just a few things that I found, and I'll read through them. And these are 2 videos that I really like. So I'll just explain why they're on the PowerPoint. So the first quote that I'll read is, "There's also something troubling when sex workers are used as a sensationalist image under the guise of feminism." And I agree with this so much. I think people, because of the nature of sex work as women using their bodies, or women profiting from their bodies, people can find it synonymous with feminism, like, wow, yes, girl boss, you know. When really, when we understand the nature of capitalism, and when we understand that any labor under capitalism is just a mode of survival, like, we will die, point blank, period. So I think it diminishes the violence of capitalism, and it kind of shies away from the precarious position many Black women are forced to be in the first place. That means that sex work is necessary, and it means that sex work is their only option to survive because of the patriarchal, sexist, misogynoirist, homophobic environment that they exist in. So that's that. And then also the next quote, Rebel Khan, a scholar, organizer, and the founder of Ho History Project, realized the responsibility we had as Black sex workers. No one will celebrate us, breathe life into our legacies, and mourn us except for us. And I think this is so true, because in every sphere of work, we know that, like, we know that racism exists. We know that all of these things exist. So it's not a safe space for us to exist in the first place, and not only exist in, but also ensure that people who follow us know that we existed in these spaces as well. So I think archiving is very important to sex work, as it is with any work. And then the final quote says, "Although sexual assault is grossly underreported, sexual violence is the second most reported form of police misconduct after use of force. The DC Trans Coalition found that 23% of Black transgender people were physically or sexually assaulted by police because they were perceived to be transgender and involved in the sex trade. Another report, Meaningful Work, found that nearly 40% of Black and Black multiracial transgender folks who have experienced exchanging sex were subjected to pervasive harassment, violence, and arrest." And again, this is just to say that sex work, I'll play the video afterwards, but it's just to say that sex work isn't empowering. It's harmful, just as any work is, but I think it's even more harmful because these people, these women and non-binary people, are putting their safety at risk. And because of transphobia, because of racism that exists, the violence could be physical, it could be mental, it could be both, it could be emotional, it could be all of these things. And I don't know, there's just an intrinsic harm to it, whereby Black trans people are bearing the brunt of it all. I don't know. So yeah, Kimia, you can go.
Yeah, I was just gonna add. Okay, cool. Yeah, I was just gonna add. Yeah, like what I learned in one of my modules was like this year was about how, like, obviously sexual violence was intrinsic to colonialism, and then there's also like the formation of sex economies, especially in like Southeast Asia, where it still like centers whiteness, and it will always be exploitative because obviously Europe underdeveloped these places so much, whereby just to, as I think you were talking about before, just to get by, like, women have to sell their bodies, or again, like, center desirability from white people in order to just, yeah, get by. And I think we can't separate it from colonialism and neo-colonialism, because obviously it's ongoing. And when we talk about sex work as liberatory, like, we do need to acknowledge, like, it globally. We can't just look at it in like a bubble. We can't just look at it in one instance in the world, because we do need to integrate it with analyses of capitalism and colonialism. Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Yeah, I completely agree. So I'm gonna play the "Sex Work Isn't Empowering" video. and then we'll go on to the Maya Angelou one.
And the book is called Gather Together
We'll
and
play the Maya Angelou one first then.
I had
It's funny.
about a very rough time at 18.
Sex work, like many jobs, is not empowering. When certified nurses' assistants, janitors, garbage truck drivers, or people in other occupations considered undesirable go into work, they are not doing it to feel empowered, but to receive compensation. The work can be empowering if the person enjoys wiping asses, cleaning up after people who barely pay them, smelling garbage, etc. Or in the case of teachers who are routinely underpaid and overworked, the salary itself is not empowering, but the work can be. But ask those same teachers if they can pay their bills with empowerment. Sorry, no. Landlords and utility companies only accept cash, checks, credit cards, and money orders. Some predatory landlords might even take sexual favors, but not empowerment. The definition of empower is to give someone the authority or power to do something. The average American is not empowered through their work to feel better about themselves, to be fulfilled socially, or to make a change in society. In the case of labor, the only empowerment most jobs give is the power to pay your bills, and plenty of jobs fail at that task, which is why so many people are homeless or in massive amounts of debt. Even still, those jobs do not turn people into targets. Those employees are not told that they are scum who don't deserve protecting, and very few people claim that those jobs should be eradicated. So why is the same courtesy and understanding not extended to sex work? The usual suspects: misogyny,
consciousness over coochie, politics over punani,
religious shame,
all the young girls who want to make life with pussy. Your pussy will perish with you in hell. May your pussy perish with you.
and a lot of projecting.
May your smooth pussy, creamier pussy, and tight pussy perish.
One thing I get pretty tired of seeing is
And yeah, just before we go on, what that quote that is just said, I might just drop out of uni and become a stripper instead. Instead, I feel like so many people say it, even if it's just like a joke. Oh yeah, like it's not that deep. Like, oh my gosh, it's essays annoying me. You might as well just drop out. And I think by doing that, we often sensationalize sex work and make it into something that it's not. We know that it's something that is a form of labor and requires a lot of labor. It requires a lot of work. And I don't think it should just be like diminished as saying, oh yeah, like this is the easier path, because more times who can climb up a pole? Like not many people. So yeah, I think this is just also say that sex work isn't, sex work can be, I think sex work can can highlight, that's the word, can highlight our, I think sex work can highlight the things that we need to do as people who strive towards liberation. It highlights the different systems of oppression that maybe we might not have considered, but that's not to say that it is intrinsically feminist, because it still exists as part of capitalism, and that's not to say that it's that's not to say that it's an option or just something that we do for fun, because we acknowledge the harm and the violence intrinsic to sex work, especially for many Black trans sex workers. So that being said, we can go on to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to read out a comment from Ish. Also, just wanted to add, although sex work isn't empowering, it's important to note how the criminalisation of sex work, brackets advocated by lots of feminist organisations in the UK, for example, pushes sex workers into greater precarity and arbitrary violence. The important thing to say is that the way to empower sex workers is not to criminalise it and its clients. It's to establish safe working conditions, ability to unionise and organise against exploitative, abusive bosses, and push for police abolition. I agree, 110%, yeah, I agree. And we will get onto like carcerality and gender in the Radicals Reading Club later, so be sure to be here for that. I'm so excited for that reading club, guys. I don't think anyone understands, but I just have like, I selected some quotes from Audre Lorde's Uses of the Erotic, which I absolutely love and adore. If you know me, you know that Audre Lorde is my auntie. Like, she's my auntie. I love her. So these are just different quotes. Feel free to like read it over and just input maybe in the chat if you agree with some things, if this text was empowering for you, what you've learned from it, if you've never read it before, if you have read it before, just like what are your thoughts of using the erotic as people? So just one thing that I've taken away from this is, okay, just something that I've taken away from this. I think using the erotic and like feeling and being sensual can have like a domino effect in the way that we engage with like our other work and the extent to which we feel. I think that's really important, and that's just one thing. I really hope that we do have like a radical reading club on this text, because when I say I love and adore this, if there's anything anyone wants to say, feel free to put it in the chat, put your hand up, or we can just go to the next slide. Okay, we can just go to the next slide. So Black women and let's talk about sexual health. Do you get it? Like the anyway. So this is an extract from Heart of the Race, and the Heart of the Race is a seminal piece. It talks about Black women's experiences in Britain just after the Windrush era. So it was written in 1985, and if you haven't accessed it before, I really do encourage that you do, because it's just so nice to hear about Black women who existed in a similar space to you, who are also experiencing similar things. As sad as it is quite comforting in knowing that this is like part of a wider legacy, and that we're building upon work that previous people have done in archiving, in telling stories, and in just like remembering. So the quote reads, "When a Black woman enters a doctor's surgery, there's another dimension to this experience, particularly if the doctor is a white middle-class man, as he usually is. In addition to the alienation arising out of our different sex and class, we also have to face false assumptions about our work, about our lives, and a host of communication barriers determined by race and culture. All these factors combine to make us feel even more vulnerable and exposed, and even less confident to question doctors' prescriptions or make demands about what is best for us. And our vulnerability is compounded by the fact that doctors frequently ask their most important questions when we are lying flat on our backs on the couch in the surgery, when there is little dignity left to salvage and little hope of challenging on the spot any of their sexist and racist assumptions about us." And yeah, I think Black women, we know that there was even a report that came out recently that said that Black women were, wait, correct me if I'm wrong, was it 2 times more likely? Was it, oh, okay, 5 times more likely, even worse, but 5 times more likely to die during childbirth. And we see that sexual health and sexual like healthcare for Black women is something that is often weaponized, and something that is made uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable experience, because even last year we saw, I mean, some people might not know, but Nicole Thea, and how she was heavily pregnant. And I think because she was such like a social media person, anyway, I had seen her on YouTube and like social media, and she had like documented her whole surgery, and without knowing that without her saying on her channel, for example, that she had trouble going up the stairs when she was pregnant, and she would tell her midwife, and her midwife wouldn't respond. It's like we wouldn't know the story and the pain and the journey as to how she ended up dying like a couple of days before she was meant to like, give birth. Or I don't think they publicly like aired the situation, but that was what was said. So yeah, I think Black women in health, it is something that is really, I don't know, it's quite scary. Not quite, it's very scary, because I think culturally as well, we're told, okay, like have children, give birth, all of these things, but the harm that is intrinsic to that process just makes it so, it's such a deterrent, even if you do want to do those things. So yeah, that's just in terms of healthcare in the UK. And I'm referring to the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and that was done in America just before the war or just after the war, I don't know. But it was done, and these men were infected with syphilis, and they didn't know that it was syphilis. Like the researchers or the organization didn't tell them that they were being, infected with syphilis. And these men, they went on to go on to their heterosexual relationships and ended up giving their like wives and their girlfriends syphilis, and that wasn't to their knowledge. And I think because of the healthcare system in America, where it is violently racist, it is violently sexist, these Black women were asking questions, and people weren't responding to them, even if they did know the answers. So they're just a few things that I'll say. But in terms of questions to all attendees, what can we do to ensure that Black women can engage with sex in a healthy and positive way? And is the historical context too sinister to mend Black women's relationship with healthcare systems throughout the world? And what alternatives are there for Black women? So I'll give people time to think. If you want to put anything in the chat, raise your hands. Again, we want a discussion going.
I mean, whilst people are thinking, I just really wanted to say, because I was speaking to, there's this new research professor / doctor in the medical school where I work, and she was talking about they're currently doing a study on just like an alternative like remedy to sort of skin, so like eczema and things like that. And she was just saying that she struggles to, like in a lot of her research, it's always white people that are the primary sort of participants and the primary sort of people that they're testing sort of these things on. But then when the treatment comes out, it's going on all skin types, all bodies, all people, but it is all, and she's always trying to fight to get more sort of Black participants, but she's always like, oh, the history means that a lot of Black people aren't willing to be participants in sort of like medical researches and like scientific researches, just because of the histories and the trauma, and not trusting sort of these systems, and not do more than what they've said they're going to do, because we know the incidence of like Black women going to sexual health clinics and also being sterilized as well, even though that's not what they went in for. And yet feminists, and especially white feminists, praise the introduction of sexual health clinics without interrogating how harmful and abusive such systems that were introduced were to Black women in those times. So it's really like, so the question of, can we ever repair Black women's relationships with healthcare systems? For me, I don't know, can we? Because the histories are very intense, they're very, but at the same time, we do need to find a way to repair them. We need to find a way to be able to, I don't know, trust them, because unfortunately, that's all that we do have. But for me personally, I try and always ensure that like any medical professional that I have is a Black person or like a Black woman, but it's always difficult to find as well. So just many thoughts going through my head. But what do other people think?
Yeah, and just to add to that, a lot of things came to mind. So sickle cell, we know that in the Black community, sickle cell is very high, and that sickle cell is a very painful disease. So when Black women go to doctors and they kind of describe how much pain they're in, a lot of doctors don't understand that, because a lot of white doctors don't understand that, because it's not something that they engage with like in their personal lives if they are just around white people. And it then makes that the sickle cell, it then means that the sickle cell process is very lonely, it's very painful, and it's just something that Black women and Black people aren't, like, they're not comfortable discussing in regards to healthcare because of its intrinsic violence. And then that just kind of shows how ableist this healthcare system is, because like it just shows the extent to how ableist it is. And then also what you were saying about skincare, again, when Black people talk about their different like skin, or even like if you used to go on Google and type in hyperpigmentation on Black skin, for example, or eczema on Black skin, you won't find pictures of white people will be coming up like, hi, listen to instructions, actually, thank you very much. But there's just not a lot of resources talking about different skin conditions that different people have, and we don't know what it looks like on Black skin. And because we don't know what it looks like, it makes it harder to treat it. So Black people are just left in a state of like limbo, like, okay, do we use all these things that people are prescribing to white people, even though we know that it wasn't made for our skin and it could even be damaging for our skin? Or should we just do everything and nothing and just be pure vibes? And then either way, like both end in harm, because there's no like education or there's no information around that. And then also COVID, like, you know, I mean, yeah, COVID is here, very here. And when we see over the past year, Black women not maybe feeling comfortable getting the vaccine because the healthcare system is racist, or Black women not, like the different factors of COVID has meant that it's just exacerbated Black women's relationship with the healthcare system, I think. And another thing that I have written down is Depo-Provera. During the 1980s and 1970s, Omar, who we spoke about yesterday in her story, one of their major campaigns was the campaign against Depo-Provera, because many doctors would just prescribe these Black women all these contraceptions, Depo-Provera especially, and the consequences could be life-threatening. Like, they were just left in a state of vulnerability because of the racist nature of the healthcare system. And then the final thing that I'll say is kind of like solutions, alternatives. And one thing could be like getting more Black doctors, for example, or like Black skin specialists. But then also with that, we know that representation is not the same as, like, it's not the same as education. And if, because of, you know, sexism, the patriarchy, all of these things, if Black men now become doctors, also because of the patriarchy and sexism, a lot of men don't know about the female anatomy. Like, they don't know where the clit is. Like, ask them, they'll say don't know. Like, they just don't know. So how are we supposed to engage with health as Black women if there's no one who knows, or if the people who do know are just in very limited supply and they're not easy to access? So yeah, that's everything that I'll say. Again, please, hands up. Kimia?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on and just say, like, generally I think there needs to be more emphasis on like men and contraception, because I think obviously, like, throughout history we've seen how contraception has affected women, especially Black women, more than other women. And like, I feel like it's their dick at the end of the day. Like, they should have their, like, I don't know what I'm saying, but like it's like there should be more emphasis on trying to find contraception for men, or like birth pills for men, because I think I've seen like loads of just infographics on Instagram saying like, oh, like even birth control for women can be harmful, and like the likelihood of blood clots from birth control is way more higher than COVID. And I think that in itself is terrifying, because the fact that there's just a lack of regard or care for women who are taking birth control. And then coupled with the fact that the healthcare system is racist and there's a lack of regard for women who will be most affected by blood clots contraception, the whole system is just so violent. And you can just really, when you look at the healthcare system, you can just really see how who is catered for, especially, and who is disregarded. But yeah, that was really badly worded.
No, I completely
that was
agree.
perfectly fine.
Amara, would you like to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think it's really important when we're talking about contraception. I think it's very funny because I think one of the vaccines, at one point there was like skepticism on whether or not people should actually take this vaccine because of the number, like the risk of blood clots in people of a certain age group. But the women's, like the pill that women have to take has a higher risk than that vaccine. But because the vaccine is supposed to be for all use, there's this concern. But when constantly pushing women towards the pill, there's no interrogation of let's find alternatives that will actually be safer, that won't actually sort of impact them in such a way they don't care because it's women who are being used, you're using these contraceptions. And it's also really important when we're talking about like contraception, like the onus is always on women to ensure that they are protected. And there's this sort of stigma if she says, I don't want to be on a pill, I don't want to be on this, use a condom. And then the man is always, in heterosexual relationships, is always like, oh, I don't want to use a condom because it doesn't feel comfortable for me. When the birth pill causes like hormonal different like hormonal problems, sometimes can even result in like mood changes and like leading towards depression and just so many things that women may not be comfortable with. But it's just like consequences that a woman is supposed to accept, and there are no alternatives as well. As also women who have PCOS, they're still being prescribed the same birth pill, which isn't great because alternatives aren't being used or catered for women to sort of have an alternative that isn't a danger to them and isn't a massive inconvenience. Just the entire way in which sexual health is always pushed towards the woman. But like Kemi said, the way in which Black women in particular are treated in sort of like health clinics is terrible. So there's always this problem, there's always this issue.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm loving the discussion that's going on in the chat. Because of time, I won't read everything out, but if you can, just go through the chat and, feel free to add. So we'll go on to the next slide now, which is sex and hypergamy. So I'll just read out two contrasting statements. One is the top one is against hypergamy, the bottom one is for hypergamy. Wait, is that right? Yeah. And then we'll go on to that question. So hypergamy is essentially when people date upwards. So they date someone perhaps in like who has more money than them, or who's someone who is like more, who is superior in society essentially. So the first one reads, much of the level up literature insidiously perpetuates racist antebellum stereotypes that characterize Black womanhood as the antithesis of fragile, respectable, and chaste femininity, a status historically reserved for white women. And then the next quote says, from settling in abusive, dangerous, and toxic relationships to marrying men who require large amounts of financial support, Black women often set ourselves up for failure. We need to change the way that Black women view love, romance, and dating, and we need to stop shaming hypergamy and dating up. This means opening up our options and possibly dating interracially, as long as they can provide for and support us. So just a few questions, we won't spend long on this, but what are the inherent problems with hypergamy, and what are the benefits of hypergamy, and why is hypergamy being paraded and praised in recent times in particular?
Can I quickly go? Anyone wants to speak, please do put your hand up. I do love hearing all of your voices. I think especially here when it talks about the whole idea that sometimes women may have to, women may have to sort of date interracially, Black women may have to date interracially in order to date up. This sort of causes a problem in the Black community, because where Black men start stumping their feet, like, well, I can't, if I date a white woman, it becomes an issue. Why can you now date a white man and that's not an issue? I think we need to understand that the world is very violent to Black women. And Black men are not our safety. They're not our protectors. They enact the same harm, violence, etc. that the white man does and the white society does upon us, because although they are Black, the fact that they are simply a man affords them so much privilege, so much safety sometimes, and they are able to use their maleness within the patriarchal structures for safety. But Black women have nowhere to hide. We are both Black and women, and so we are hit several times with a double whammy with like pain and So sometimes when women choose to date up, it's because they are doing so to sort of their own safety, as a way to protect themselves, so in a way to analyze the situation, like, I have safety nowhere to date up. Sometimes means that I'm trying to find some safety underneath this relationship. Of course, it has problems, because you may be dating a person who is racist, and so avoid it. But just because this person is racist, oh my God, this sentence is going to be whack. This person is racist, but so is the Black man who is colorist, sexist, and enacting harm on you. So which one affords you the most safety in your relationship? Which one can protect you more? Which one will allow you more safety? So like, there's people have issues with Black women interracial relationships, but yes, divest from men. If any of you het women are in het relationships, I'm so sorry for you, divest, please, hi. But if you can afford some safety elsewhere, then I do think you should do it. If that is the case. For me personally, I do only date Black men, but that's only a culture thing, because of culture, and like, I want to date an Igbo man, and that's the only reason. But if you can find safety in some protection in dating up, then do so, because the world is already going to be violent. You should find a way that will be safe for you. Yeah. You okay?
I completely agree with you, Mara, like everything you said. And I don't really have like a comment, but I also have a question, because you know the recent, I don't know if it's a recent trend or if it's been going on for ages, but the whole AMBW, like Asian man, Black woman, that like, since Asian men are seen as like the least desirable men, and Black women are seen as the least desirable women, they should like start dating within each other. And I was just wondering like what you guys think, like that. I don't know if this relates to hypergamy either, but like, is that like a fetishization? It sounds like a safe space, to be honest, because it is that thing of like, there are unsafe spaces in other like dating amongst like our own races and with other races. But yeah, is it like some fetishization going on in that dynamic?
I think for me personally, it depends on the intention and why you're dating this individual. If you're dating the individual at recognition that you're both being harmed within society, but bear in mind, being harmed in society and you're still attracted to them, then you can still date. But if you're doing it because you find you are leaning towards this Orientalist sort of ideals surrounding their being, then please divest from doing so, because we're not trying to lean into sort of fetish relationships, because that's wrong. Does anyone, I don't have a conclusive sort of opinion on it, Rachel.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, I think it's quite easy to kind of shift focus from hypergamy and make it into something that's quite like individual, because as much as, you know, I want an easy life, I'll be real. I don't want no pain, no trauma, no nothing. However, I also acknowledge that, babe, actually the world's set up against. So yeah, I think it's quite easy to individualize it. I think while hypergamy can like provide temporary safety or like temporary protection, we also need to like think about who the protection is at the expense of. So even if it is, for example, an interracial relationship, heterosexual relationship, for example, where a white man is affording you, because the white man does not experience racism, and because the white man does not experience sexism, they are able to now navigate the world in a different way to you, in a different way than you are, and they're allowed to kind of like string you along, that doesn't diminish that they were able to do so at the expense of Black and brown people throughout the world, at the expense of capitalism, for example. So yeah, I think it's quite easy to individualize it, but I think in the wider realm of things, it's important that we shouldn't kind of resort to temporary safety. Like, I don't want to be safe temporarily. Like, I want a permanent state of safety. I want a permanent state of protection, and that is only afforded once all of these factors don't exist anymore. That's all I'll say. Ade, I saw that you had your hand up. Also, I know that it's 12 o'clock now. We will run 10 minutes over, and then we'll start the next event 10 minutes later. So, yeah. So, Ade, if you want to go, or if anyone else wants to go.
Wait, is the thing on?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. I was gonna say that I personally hate hypergamy. I think it's sexist. I think it's misogynistic. I think it's racist and classist. Like, ideas about high value and like leveling up treats human beings like they're Pokemon. And like, there's some people who are just better than other people, and those are the people that you need to go for. It's just inherently classist to me personally, because rich people can be terrible people too, and they can be violent too, and they often are, and people often have to do really like bad things in order to get wealthy in life. Or they have to exploit somebody else a lot of the time. And then also it's like, just to me, like, I don't understand like the trend that's going around of like it feels like we're going backwards with like romanticizing like being a housewife and being a kept woman, because it's like lots of people deliberately wanted to leave this arrangement because it's a hotbed for abuse, because you're financially dependent on a man, and that person can withdraw or use those finances to abuse you and manipulate you. So like this idea that the place, I don't know, that like the heterosexual partnership with a rich man can be a place of specifically a rich white man can be a place of safety. To me, I don't believe it. Like, I don't really buy it. I think it's about purchasing power, how much people can buy, how can people like show their more class status, how can people ascend up the ladder. But like, safety and security is something that has to be determined like collectively. Like, you have to have your like the idea that partnering up with a rich white man is a guarantee of safety. It's like that's privatization of safety. Like, you're being privatized and going into this, you know, heterosexual partnership with this rich white man and but like, that's not keeping most other people safe. And then also like 1% of people own like 60% of the wealth in this world. So like, who can afford to do this hypergamy? Because there's not enough men to go around. So in order to then determine who gets the good value men, you're gonna have to start getting into some really sexist shit, which is what a lot of the hypergamy girls are doing. You need to be more feminine, and this is the way, and like all these feminine classes and all that sort of stuff, which are just so anti-black and anti-trans and just terrible. And classes and homophobic and just all of the ists and obias that you can imagine. So then determining who gets those to access those men, you're gonna like run up into a whole heap of problems, which is already happening within the hypergamous movement. And then it's like, even when you like, I don't know, it just doesn't make sense to me in the grand scheme of things, because if we're saying that, you know, things need to be redistributed and this isn't the world that we're going to live in, prioritizing heterosexual women or like women who date men who can then like you're trying to get power basically, and like anyone can do that. Like, it's not just men who can enact just really terrible violent things. Women do that and can do that all of the time. And so that kind of hypergamy, that's what I see that this as, is like a form of women who can date up, who are often either normally ascending themselves quite socially or like climbing up themselves socially or economically, who can then like do this sort of stuff. And it's just doesn't make sense to me. Like, majority of people in the world are poor. So like this just doesn't make sense. And also this whole thing is very much dependent on where you live in the globe. Like there's a reason why like this kind of hypergamous movement started in America. Like these are places where capital is being hoarded at such astronomical rates compared to everywhere else. So like you being able to find even like a rich man and even being able to find a rich man will be hard enough. And the reason why a lot of these men won't be men of your own race, won't be black men, is specifically because of racial capitalism. So like all of the reasons why, it just points to the idea that hypergamy is a bad idea. But obviously there are personal benefits that some women can gain for, you know, doing it, and like, and they can thrive and flourish. But like, yeah, I just don't really think that that's a collective politics at all, or like a feminist politics. And some things, like, people can make choices, but they don't have to like make it a feminist thing. Like you can just say I'm a hypergamist without saying I'm doing empowerment or I'm doing liberation, because it's not that. Like, just everyone can just be like, I want to do this, and I know it's not empowering, and that's fine. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Ade. In the chat, Holly says domestic labour / being a housewife is still just as valuable, and having the option to do so and being compensated justly has been the objective of many liberation movements. And yes, I agree. We'll quickly move on to the next slide, and we'll rush through that, and then we'll go on to the final slide, I believe. Should be 2 more slides. Oh, okay, we're not talking anymore. No, okay, actually, if we can go to the slide before this, because that is, and then we can talk about sex in schools and consent, and Amara, you can go to talk about that.
Okay, I thought it would have been like fair if we spoke about sex without talking about consent, because the teaching of like consent in schools are like, it's woefully like inadequate. We're taught about like the stats and figures, about different sexual health conditions, the risks, the dangers and consequences and implications. And all of this is just like very subtle deterrents around the topic of sex, to be like, sex is dangerous, just avoid it at all costs and you'll be fine. And many schools then just don't teach consent. And if they do, it is lacking the exploration of how prevention of sexual violence is not just about teaching men about consent. Like, because they teach, if you know all of these things, sexual violence will not happen, but that's not the case, because of course, content warning, of course, but the enactment of like sexual violence it's about power, authority, and control, because men are socialized within like these structures to be dominant, violently dominant even, and aggressive, because they taught that that's the only method and route to like obtaining respect, power, and authority, and these can only be acquired through force and dehumanization. And consent is about agency. It's about acknowledging my own existence and being seen as a human deserving of like rights and personal control and autonomy over my will and my being and myself. The act of sexual violence and the act of rape is intentional removal of that, is awareness of I can gain sort of power and control over this person by removing this thing that is theirs, which is, words are terrible, by trying to remove or take away their ability to say this is my being and this is my right and my control over myself. So like rape and like sexual assault as violation of these rights are like, they're not due to an unawareness of consent, and to always teach consent as, if you know all of these things, you will, if you know all these things that you've covered, there is no such thing as rape, is just wrong, because we're ignoring and we're denying how power structures which exist within our society, how capitalism, just the way in which the society is formed, means that it's not just about yes, no, enthusiasm, etc. So basically, like, just schools simply teaching consent as just an enthusiastic yes just removes the multifaceted like nature, sex. No, okay. Removes the multifaceted nature like sex, natures like sex occurs within our society, because when someone says yes, we need to consider the different weightings of yes and no, depending on the mouths in which those words come out from, because this is a very like oversimplified example, but when a white cis man says yes, that yes has more assurance, more conviction, more guarantee that the yes is actually a yes than a Black or brown woman, especially working class poor woman, when she is saying yes, it could be out of fear of their safety, their job, their lives, or the yes is as a form of like a transactional sort of agreement where the exchange of sex is for money, and all that yes is based upon that I'm going to say yes to this transactional agreement because you're going to give me money for this, and this money is needed for food, for my kids, for shelter, for safety, for all of these things. And so yes, consent is being able to say yes. It's about being enthusiastic. It's about getting consent at every single sort of sexual interaction. It's about understanding that a person has a right to withdraw consent at any point, and that is still okay. It's not about pressuring someone. It's not about being like coercing them into these situations, but we need to understand that there is more complication within consent, and it's a lot of the times we can't remove the agency from sexual assaulters and sexual abusers and say they did not know when we are finding ways to like reconcile the situation and to heal, because we can't just tell survivors of sexual assault, oh, I'm so sorry, this has happened to you, this person did not know, we're going to teach them about consent, because that's not the case. It's about power dynamics and being abused. So ultimately, let's abolish patriarchy, let's abolish these power structures that relies on power structures, and things we're moving in a better direction. But of course, in the meantime, everyone learn what consent is, because basic understanding is still better than no understanding, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that, Amara. Completely agree. And yeah, we're going to quickly go on to the next slide and then we'll close. Yeah, so we're going to go on to the next. So very quickly, just talking about like sex and reclamation, I think in media, that's the major way that I've personally seen, like I love and adore Lil' Kim. Listen, I love and adore her. Queen of Rap, and also Cardi and Megan. I think talking about sex openly and like as much as, you know, they perform sex and they, you know, like we see them in media, there are still a lot of conversations that we need to have in our interpersonal relationships that inform how openly and how comfortable Black women feel about talking about sex. So I'll let people think about these questions because we have run like over time, but I've really enjoyed this discussion. I feel like we should do a part 2 sometime. I don't know, a lot of us are leaving, so when is the part 2 ever going to happen? We'll cook something up. But again, thank you everyone for coming. Our next event is But What About Rapists? Why Incarceration Isn't the Solution to Sexual Violence. And I'll say that will start, is an 8-minute break, okay? We'll start at 20 past. So yeah, get a drink, come back, and then we'll have like a new PowerPoint and everything. But thank you everyone for joining, for your contributions, for the discussions. And yeah, I'll see you all in 8 minutes.